Chapter 5. If I remember my old maps right, the ruin of a city named Iam should be coming into view over the next rise. They had travelled for nearly a mile along the twisting path until they found themselves emerging out onto open grassy plains. Hitch had stayed turned around as Cielo had steered, laying his crossbow across the roof of the caravan, a second bolt between his teeth to reload in a hurry. Cielo had managed to reload hers as well, taking the reins between her teeth as she twisted the knurled knob on the end to pull back the string and lock it into place. Pretty sure we've lost them now, but don't ease up on them mules just yet. They crested the rise and the city came into view. The rolling, ploughed fields of farmlands had turned to grass, the farmers' cottages crumbling in thick moss that seemed to be squeezing them until the roofs had broken and caved in. The edges of the forest had crept in unevenly, a silent army besieging the abandoned settlement. As they got closer, they noticed no gates barred the entrance. Fragments of timber still clung to the rusting hinges. The stone wall surrounding the city had crumbled, grassy fingers reaching up from the ground. Flowers sprouted in the cracks and gaps worn in the mortar. Almost there. Let's get inside and find somewhere to hide. The caravan jostled over the uneven ground, the cobblestones lifting up in places where tree roots had grown underneath, snaking along in the dark, fertile soil. The decayed buildings which lined the streets were like broken skulls, empty door frames and windows leering like hollowed eye sockets and gaping mouths. The wind roared through them, giving voice to unearthly moans. "Where do we go now?" Cielo asked, with a waver in her voice, her nerves already on edge as she kept looking around in all directions. "Turn down there. Looks like stables." They trotted down a laneway toward a large stone structure, which seemed to have withstood the test of time better than its neighbors. It was 2 stories tall, with empty window frames on the second floor, and large, heavy wooden doors still in place on the ground. Pulling up to the building, Hitch and Cielo jumped off and quickly ran over. Gripping the heavy iron rings that still hung in place, they heaved until the doors gave way and opened up before leading the mules and their caravans inside. "There, we should be safe here," Hitch said as they bolted the doors from the inside. "Quick now, grab my tools." Boards were stripped internally and placed along the empty windows before being hammered into place. Heavy barrels rolled over to be propped up against the boards for extra protection. Sweat poured from their brows as they rushed back and forth, terror giving them incredible strength and stamina. With the last board hammered into place, they collapsed against each other, sinking down onto the dusty floor as they caught their breath. "There, that'll keep those damn things out of here." Hitch was bright red, his cheeks flushed like ripe tomatoes still fresh on the vine. Cielo worried that he would keel over in a minute, that she would be left alone to stand against those things out there. Hurrying off, she came back with a skin of water, which he greedily gulped from before catching himself and passing it back to her. The sweat that had soaked their clothes had started to evaporate, causing them to shiver as their temperature rapidly dropped in the cool stone building. "I see a hearth over there. Why don't you light us a fire for our evening meal?" Cielo paused for a moment, looking confused. "We're done hiding now, little one. We've found a good place to defend here." Soon the glow of a small fire filled the stables, as Cielo made herself busy with the pots and pans. Tea was brewed and a hearty soup prepared. The mules came over and sat down by the fire to warm themselves, as Hitch and Cielo enjoyed their meal and for a moment reveled in the simple comforts of hot meals in their belly and warming flames kissing their faces. "What do we do now?" Cielo asked, looking up from her soup bowl with a sudden expression of great concern. "We hunker down here for the night. Those things might not have even bothered to follow us to this cursed place." The last 2 words caused her eyebrows to shoot up in shock. Hitch stumbled as he tried to recover. "What I mean, as in by that well, don't worry, I'm too tired to know what I'm saying." "Have you ever heard the rumors about this place?" "Rumors? But rumors always persist, no matter how out of date or inaccurate they are. Cielo cocked her head to the side, indicating with a rolling of her wrist that he was to continue with this line of thought. The people of this place worshipped a god that rose up and swallowed the unfaithful. Cielo looked more confused than when she had begun her line of questioning, and now regretted having gone down this cryptic path. Towns are raised up and walked out on throughout history for all kinds of reasons, none of which have anything to do with the gods the people that live there prayed to. Hitch did his best to try and reassure the girl. Let's try and bed down for a while. We'll need to be well rested for tomorrow. Weapons within easy reach, they lay down on their sides, their backs touching as they faced away from one another. They listened for the sound of something moving outside, trying to pick up on anything while praying they heard nothing. Don't worry, little one. We're all right now, Hitch whispered over his shoulder to her. A minotaur at full charge couldn't batter down those doors. He tried to comfort her. Have you ever seen a minotaur? She asked, glad for the distraction. That I have. A great column of them, stripped to the waist, iron collars around their necks, linked to the one in front and behind by heavy chains. Cielo could picture them in her mind, heads bowed as they shuffled along. Now, I don't right know if you could have called them a group or a pack, but I was warned that there is something you must never call a group of minotaurs. What's that? A herd. Any reference to cattle is a great insult to a minotaur. They look down on cattle the same way that elves look down on humans. Or dwarves look down on gnomes and gully dwarves, Cielo cut in. That is very different, Hitch whispered too loudly, pausing for a moment to check if something had heard him. Cielo smiled to herself. She had learned early on that it was quite the sore point for Hitch if any comparison was made between dwarves and their smaller, more eccentric cousins. Get some rest now. We will need it come the morning. She covered her mouth to stifle a laugh before stretching out, wondering how she was ever going to get to sleep as the energy drained from her limbs and her eyelids grew heavier and heavier. As her eyelids closed, another much larger began to slowly crack open. Scaled skin parted to reveal the glassy globe of an eyeball tall enough to come up to a man's waist, with a vertical slash of a pupil dissecting it in half. The blood-red orb, fading to orange around its outer edge, seemed to glow with its own internal light. Deep within its hibernating slumber, it had detected the faint vibrations of something moving in the city above, which had long been devoid of life. The maw parted just wide enough to allow its forked tongue to extrude slick with saliva. It swayed to and fro as it tasted the stale, fetid air that had not been stirred by even the passage of a scavenging rat, as all living creatures instinctively knew to avoid its nest. Cords of muscle, thicker than the mast of a sailing ship, began to uncoil, rippling beneath the black scaled skin. In undulating waves, it moved forward through the circular archway that marked the entrance to its nest, its flanks almost scraping against the precisely placed stones that had worn smooth down the years it had come to know this place as its home. In the years that had followed the cataclysm, when men had turned their backs on the gods and no longer passed along their teachings to their children, until their grandchildren had thought of them as nothing more than fanciful bedtime tales, the people of Iam had taken to the worship of a snake. It had not begun as such. The creature had come to reside in the city after being left behind by a traveling troupe of performers. The city fathers had an enclosure built so that the people of Iam could come and see. Some vendors began to set up their stalls, and tax collectors were charging admission. Live rabbits were sold at higher prices than the butchers charged for skinned ones, and with great relish and delight people took to throwing the rabbits into the enclosure, where it would be quickly hunted down and devoured. Children would turn away as it struck with lightning speed, beaking through their fingers as the fluffy creature disappeared into its distended jaws. As the years passed, the snake grew larger and larger, until its proportions were monstrous to behold, and a generation did not exist that could remember a time before it came to dwell amongst them. Mystical powers were attributed to it. Its feedings became known as offerings. Conmen, tired by even the idea of an honest day's work, appeared to declare themselves its priests, all knowing of the origin of its birth and the blessings it could grant upon the favored. A temple was erected in the center of the city, concentric circles of paving stones laid one upon the other as a stack of platters, decreasing in diameter with each level. Diamond-shaped tiles were inlaid along each riser to give the impression that the serpent itself were wound around it. The uppermost layer was topped with a dome building. Its singular entrance, wider than 4 men standing shoulder to shoulder, was carved into the shape of a gaping maw. Red-stained glass windows glittered as baleful eyes, bathing the inner sanctum in blood-soaked beams of light. Creature and coffers swelled as the penitents appeared to place their offerings before the stony-faced priests. Peeking between the iron bars of its enclosure, the giant snake swayed back and forth as it took the measure of its prey, who quickly averted their gaze, lest they offend its divine sensibilities. When the cold winds of bitter harvests blew in the face of the generous donations, even the most faithful began to question their devotion when left staring at empty cupboards and their hollow-cheeked children. The most vocal of these doubters were stolen from their beds in the middle of the night, dragged off to be devoured by the ravenous reptile. Their sudden departures did not quell other voices, joining an ever-growing din of dissenters. When the angry mob appeared at the foot of the stone steps, the priests did the unthinkable. Swinging open the huge iron gate that had held it in captivity, it emerged from its prison into the daylight. The sun shimmered from its black scales, as glossy as spilled ink. Rising up, it glowered at the sea of humanity arrayed before it, while in the deepest part of its ancient reptilian brain it screamed, "Pray!" The people of Iam died that day. They died under the crushing weight of stampeding feet. They died as fangs longer than their forearms pierced clean through their bodies. They died as they burst like ripe fruit beneath a pounding pestle, trapped in the crushing coils of their living god. The survivors scattered as the field mouse before the farm cat in abject terror, racing from the city with the clothes upon their backs and precious little else. They stood on the plains, staring back at their former home, flashes of the terrible attack playing in their mind's eye. Unable to bring themselves to take a step forward toward the city gates to try and collect something with which to start over, they had turned upon their heels to trudge along the great wide road that was once jammed with the traffic of merchants coming to market. Having struck and bitten, coiled and constricted, sucked down and swallowed a dozen or more of its victims, until no part of its length was not distended, the serpent slowly slithered along until it found a gaping portal that led into the sewer system beneath the city, where it would come to make its nest. The priests had thrown down their robes, garbing themselves in the clothes of common travellers as they made their escape, laden down with as many copper and steel pieces as they could carry to start new lives in distant corners of Kryn. As the years passed, the forest grew closer and closer to reclaim the land abandoned by men. The buildings rotted under the deluges of rain, timbers cracking under the strain of the weight that they fought to still support. The serpent slumbered, as all apex predators do, until it sensed the presence of a wandering woodland creature or a party of adventurers seeking to pick through the ruins in hopes of finding treasures which had long been carried away. Despite its massive size, it remembered well the inherited instinct of the ambush predator, pressing itself down, shaping itself to fit its environment until its meal wandered into striking distance. The animals were easy: deers and horses, sheep and cows, born wild and free, or on the run from a farmer's herd, it did not matter. They came to graze upon the lush green grasses and drink from the wide, deep puddles where water had pooled in sunken cobblestone streets. The adventurers had camped beside blazing fires under starry skies. Their lives all ended the same. The blissful ignorance, a second of terrifying realization, and then the numbing pain as they stared wide-eyed, unbelieving, at the fangs punching through their bodies by a creature of impossible and terrifying dimensions that looked upon them with murderous triumph in the final moments of their lives.